Hello and welcome to the second episode of Payara Podcast. My name is Dominika Tesarz-Sochacka and I will be your host for this episode. Today I would like to invite you to listen to another conversation I had with Rachel Stevens, Senior Analyst at Redmonk, the developer-focused industry analyst company, and Steve Milic, Founder and CEO of Payara, the creators of Payara Server and Payara Micro Jakarta Runtimes and Payara Cloud. You may recognize Rachel and Steve as my guests from the previous episode of Payara Podcast. I invited them back to talk a bit more about open source, this time in light of the announcement made by HashiCorp in August, who decided to transition from the open source public license to the business source license. As described on their website, HashiCorp is a tech company founded in 2012 with the goal of solving some of the hardest, most important problems in infrastructure management and to help organizations create and deliver powerful applications faster and more efficiently. So why we thought it's important to discuss this case? Because for more than a decade, HashiCorp continued to build new products and features provided to the community under a free open source license. This has led to a large community of users, contributors, partners, and customers who participate in and benefit from the work of the HashiCorp products. So we wanted to talk about this case and other similar ones to see what's the real meaning and motivations behind such decisions to move away from open source and what impact changes like this may have on the open source users, both commercial and non-commercial ones. I also wanted to use this opportunity to invite you to try Payara products if you haven't already. We have free trials available for all of our runtimes, which you can access on our website, payara.fish. We are also still running a special trial for Payara Cloud, available on our website as well for a limited time, so check it out while you still can. Okay, so let's listen to part 2 of our open source conversation with Rachel and Steve. Open source for all, a closer look at the HashiCorp case. Thanks for tuning in and enjoy. Right, hello and welcome back, Rachel and Steve. It's good to see you again. So we're meeting up again today to talk a bit more about the topic we covered last time in the first Payara podcast episode, because we wanted to comment on the news that came out shortly after our last conversation, which is the news about HashiCorp adopting business source license. And I explained this in a bit more detail in the introduction to this episode for those listeners who may need a bit more context to it. Rachel, what were your first thoughts when you heard about HashiCorp's announcement, especially in the context of our previous podcast and our conversations we've had only a few days before?
I think my first thought was like, oh, what rotten timing. Because this would have been lovely to talk about in our previous episode about enterprise open source, because I do think that this, while any one individual piece of licensing news, I think is just that, a piece of news and something that impacts that individual community, I think the HashiCorp news has some degree of serious nature in terms of starting to move some of the licensing changes that we've seen. We've seen the licensing changes in the database category in particular of databases that were previously open source and then relicensed to something that was more proprietary, more closed source, not a true open source license. And I think starting to see that come into the infrastructure world with Hashi is something that is a notable shift and one that I think is worth chatting about. So it's one of those ones where I have a lot of thoughts and I could just spew words at you, but yes, let's hear what Steve thought.
Yeah, I mean, in the context of, I would say, the previous podcast, it would be good to have spoken about it then. I think my view of the HashiCorp, it is a trend, but I think it's a trend driven largely by how those companies of that form are financed, as opposed to the overall open source strategy or the impact on open source. I think it's an end point of a venture capital driven company that's gone public and now needs to make a profit. I don't think it undermines the whole business model of open source fundamentally.
Yeah, and just for those who maybe don't keep up with all that, so the companies I'm thinking about would be things like Mongo, Redis, Confluent, Elastic, Sentry did this. So I mean, it feels like it's been largely concentrated in the database space, but it's definitely not exclusive to the database space.
Just going to question that. Is that, I mean, Confluent, you put Confluent in there, but is that really the same thing? Because Confluent is a open core product based on Apache Kafka. So
I guess they shifted some of their things into, and I think this is true of Redis too, where they have a core thing that they have left alone, but a lot of their modules they've moved into proprietary licenses. So yes, I have definitely conflated different licensing moves in this list. Well, this is not a list of everybody who has like moved to the BSL license like Terraform. Rather, this is a list of people who have changed their open source strategy via their license, basically to make it easier for them to commercialize their product.
Yeah, because I think, I mean, some ways that, HashiCorp will say business source licenses is very free and open, but following a switch to business source to me from, say, an open core model seems to me more brutal from a license perspective. It's like a complete switch. It's not like there's an open source project that they are commercializing through open core. It seems like, we're done with open source. We're switching.
Yes. And I think one of the things that we've seen a lot of debates about recently is, does the community really care about what open source is? Like we've seen this trend of these people who have changed to closed licenses or source available licenses or non-compete licenses. You can call them a whole variety of things. And people continue using the project for, well, by and large. I mean, there's definitely groups that can no longer use certain projects, or their legal team prohibits it, or you have to switch something over. And so it started to see community things of like, does the open source definition matter? And I think that as a question is very concerning, because I think the reason that anyone is in a position to not care about the open source definition is because that the open source definition has been guarded so carefully for the last few decades. And so it worries me that we are at a crossroads for open source in terms of how this all comes together.
All right, so for those listeners who may not know exactly what the BSL or business source license is, it is a source available license that allows copying, modification, redistribution, non-commercial use, and commercial use under specific conditions. So it's basically an alternative license that includes restrictions on commercial usage, and its aim is to enable the commercial sponsors, such as HashiCorp in this case, to have more control around commercialization. So what does that mean in practice for the users, both commercial and non-commercial, of the software that adopts that type of license, the BSL license? How big of a change is this in practical terms?
For a lot of end users, it's probably not a huge hit, because my guess is that they have legal teams who've already reviewed like Mongo's license or things. So they have the BSL framework probably already somewhere in their enterprise. I guess, sorry, Mongo's actually SSPL, but I'm guessing like Cockroach, Couchbase, like Sentry. My guess is that legal teams have at least seen the business source license at some point. So it's not something where it's necessarily going to be like an AGPL thing where all of a sudden your source code is tainted and you have kind of this contamination concern. But it does require legal review, probably because the framework is one that requires people to understand the restrictions in and around use. And I think one of the things is that they've made, Hashi has anyways, they've said that their FAQ is binding, but there's a lot of things that exist in the FAQ that don't exist in the license. So just the level of confusion and ambiguity is significant. I think a lot of end users probably are not hugely impacted. I think one of the community impacts that I think is going to be interesting is to see whether or not the ecosystem that has developed in and around Hashi's products, and particularly around Terraform, is going to be as vibrant as it has been. And we have seen moves in the ecosystem to fork. I don't know if that fork is going to have enough legs or momentum to actually carry significant momentum away from the core project. But I do think that it'll be interesting to watch.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes down to impact, I'm not sure. I mean, I don't know how many organizations do adopt pure BSL without purchasing a subscription and having a commercial license, because when you actually look at it, if you're an IP lawyer and you look at it, it's incredibly vague. I mean, there has FAQs associated with it, but it just talks about compete. Now, there's some definitions of what that compete means, like embed in a competing product, but it's not really clear for things like, I don't know, anyone who may be providing third-party managed services, even if it's not a cloud, but what an SI does for a third-party organization. Does that compete? Does it not compete? If I was a lawyer, and I'm not, from my experience, most lawyers will be, that is just not defined, so there is a level of commercial risk. So probably purchase a subscription. But then end users that don't read licenses, then they're probably not impacted.
True.
But whether if you go to a large organization and they and an IP lawyer reads it, and whether they actually continue on the bare license, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think a lot of one of the great things about open source is that it gives end users the freedom to pick up a project without having to read the license. So it's like, okay, if it's MIT, if it's Apache, if it's Mozilla public license, like my organization has pre-approved me to use those and I'm good. And if you don't fall in those buckets of like clean use, it becomes infinitely harder for you to pick up the project and figure it out. And I think the other thing that came to me while you were talking, Steve, was whether or not I compete now is one thing. I think one of the things that maybe ties into what we've seen in the Java world is what happens if the company, like, what if Hashi got acquired? Like, what if Hashi gets acquired by Oracle? And then all of a sudden the definition of who competes with who gets very muddy and very murky very quickly. And so, like, I think you also can't assume a constant state of the world, and which is why the ambiguity is also worrying.
Yeah, I think the ambiguity from a legal is a concern for if I was an IP lawyer and an organization, because what's that actually, what does it mean? Yeah, say and acquisition doesn't say anything. It doesn't say anything about change of control or anything like that. And I mean, you touched upon, is this a turning point for open source? And I don't know if it is, because I think you'd have to decide whether someone could build the community that they can build without open source, without switching it, like start on BSL, and can you build a business on starting on BSL? Or is this just an endpoint for some large organizations that need to make money? And I don't mean make money in the sense of revenue, I mean actually need to turn a profit.
Yeah, I think you touched on it, that a very important point for us. Like, I think that it is a variety of companies acting in concert, and it feels like sometimes explicitly, not always explicitly, but sometimes with the guidance of VC-backed founders who want to have better commercialization options for the software. And I think when you start to have some of those concerted pushes that are coming from concentrated places, and you start to have, I feel like it's a little bit of an Overton window where we start to see the acceptable. I think if you would have asked me 5 years ago what would happen to a company that does a license change like this and rug pulls on their community, the definition of open source and all of the work and all the things have come in, I think I would have assumed that it would be catastrophic. But I think that what we've seen is that the more it's happened, the more we've come to see it as something that happens to these single vendor open source projects. And I think that's concerning.
Yeah, that could be. I mean, I think it's a rug pull on community to some extent. I mean, it depends how much community is really there from a contribution perspective, and for end users, then many of their customers will continue paying. I mean, so to me, that's a commercial. Someone who's not a VC-backed open source founder, who's nowhere near their size whatsoever, but it's that business model. It's buying customers through huge amounts of sales and marketing spend. So I don't think it's to do with IP licenses or ability to fund R&D based off current customers. I just think it's an end goal of something that's gone public and now really needs to make a profit. And they see that by monetizing the base that they have and growing a cloud-hosted competition against, say, one of the public clouds, basically.
Yeah, and I think it does have something to do with competition and making sure that they sort of save the space and us keep themselves competitive and that sort of leads me to the next question I had to you, Steve, specifically as a open source business owner and founder. So in their announcement, Aman Daga, the HashiCorp co-founder, he says that one of the main reasons for the decision is that there is increasingly more other vendors who take advantage of the community work on OSS projects for their own commercial goals, and they do that without providing material contributions back. So hence the need for evolving or evolving the license, I guess. Did you notice anything similar in your line of business? Is that really the case? Does it have such a huge impact?
I think probably the dirty secret of commercial open source is that not many people actually do contribute at the end of the day. Contribution from community is a small proportion. Therefore, you need to fund an engineering team to drive projects forward, and most successful projects have the commercial organizations behind them. Does that mean other companies can take that contribution and use it for their benefit? Yes, because it's open source. Does it mean you can't grow an open source company profitably or without huge burn? No, you definitely can build an open source company without huge burn and make profit. So I think it depends on what you're trying to achieve, from a financial perspective. So customers or people are always going to take a free product and use it, and they will capture some part of that value, and maybe they capture more value than you do in the source code. But I don't think that means that that's the only way that makes open source unsustainable. I mean, there's various models of open source. There's like open core. You take like Apache Kafka and you build a service, you build a product on top of it with enterprise features, and you charge license on top of that. That's great. That's very in some ways, you know what you're getting. You've got it's a freemium model, if you say so to speak, or you can do sell software maintenance, which is what Pyara does effectively. We sell binaries. It's open source, but we have a community product. Enterprise, I mean, open source is literally the license is the source code. It's not the binaries. So you can ship enterprise binaries with different license, and that's what we do. And that's what Red Hat and people do. Or you can do hosting. And so Amazon will capture, or some big clouds are capturing a lot of that operations revenue. But I wouldn't say that's where most software companies set out to capture that revenue. It's just one of the effects of that's happening now. So going back to the thing, I don't think this is fundamental to open source business models and being able to monetize open source. But we do see obviously people capture different value in different ways from some software product.
Yeah. And I think when you're talking about the value capture, like what I'm seeing in a lot of these license shifts is that these companies have wanted to use the benefits of open source to kind of keep their funnel really wide, get users in the door, make it easy for people to get started, and then shift that value capture dynamic later on. And that really feels to me like it's the essence of what's happening with these license shifts.
Yeah, I mean, it could be, I mean, I can see that a lot of value capture has gone to public cloud. So, but HashiCorp obviously didn't set out as a cloud company, it set out as a software company. I mean, I'm not super familiar with HashiCorp, and I don't see license, Amazon are selling software maintenance, or any public cloud is selling software maintenance on HashiCorp. But what they're doing is providing hosted services. And that's capturing a lot of value. And maybe that's all end users care about,
I think Hashi was particularly going after some of their competitors like M0 and Spacelift and Digger and Groundwork. Like I think the ones that have built services like directly on top of the Terraform open source code, that to me feels like it was more where they were kind of aiming more so than the cloud. But like I do think that it's absolutely, I think everyone is thinking about cloud competitors these days because it's part of the ecosystem.
Yeah, so it does feel like it is all about commercial, non-commercial use of the product and sort of fighting competitors or saving your space in the marketplace, and yeah, just making sure that yeah, you keep your customers and you keep your code. So what do you think in this case, if this HashiCorp case is all about commercial versus non-commercial use of the products, what do you think about the argument that open source licenses should only be used for non-commercial purposes then? Is that how it should be? Is this what it is all about?
People are free to license their software however they want. Like if you want to have closed source proprietary software and that's what makes sense for you, like absolutely you are free to do that, but you can't conflate it with open source. So like if you want to have restrictions on use, then you should not be calling it open source, muddying the waters of what's open source and what's proprietary. So I think that's where the big problems come in. It's like if you want to have usage restrictions, it's not an open source product.
Yeah, I agree. I think, if they shouldn't. I think one of the dangers people trying to still claim open source when it's not open source anymore.
Mm-hmm.
You can't have fields of use restrictions for open source license, end of. And if a company for commercial reasons wants to switch from an open source license to a commercial license, then they should just say that's what they're doing, and then and not pretend that in some ways that it's similar as it was before, because it just fundamentally not. And they should just put their hands up and say we're moving to a commercial license because we need to try and capture more value and make more money.
So I think yeah, sorry, Steve. Yeah, I'm just thinking of the next question. I would probably want to ask directly to Arman Dagger, the actual HashiCorp co-founder, because it's about if you have any tips for building commercially viable open source business, because obviously that's what they did with HashiCorp, without, to some extent and to some point, sacrificing any ideals of open source, because it is clearly possible to build commercially viable open source business. Do you have any tips on how to approach this without going into the business license?
Should I take that first?
Yeah, I think so.
You
probably have the hands-on experience.
Yeah,
I think first it's like any business. Fundamentally, it's down to any business and how are you financing it, and then what's your end goal. I mean, if it's about value capture, so if you can capture enough value from software maintenance or freemium, then you can build a model to do that, and or from hosting. At the end of the day, there's different ways to capture value from what is a piece of software, and when I say open source, again, it only applies to the source code, so not distribution of that source code, not software maintenance or any of those things, or not the trademarks, nor anything like that. So you can build a commercial model from open source if you understand where your value capture is. If you are venture capital funded and they are basically, you're spending a lot of money up front to acquire customers. For example, again, digging into HashiCorp, they have to somehow keep those customers for as long as they can and to monetize it and spend money up front. That's just one way to grow, but it's not the only way. That's all about timing. So if you want to spend a lot of money to get a lot of customers quick and then have to monetize them afterwards, then you need a way to keep the cash flow in. But it's just standard business, really. And similarly, if you pick a model where you fund your growth in your customer base from your existing customers, then you can build it without losing lots of money. So I think it all just depends on the timing. So I don't believe this means that there is no open source business models that can make money. I think what we're seeing is a lot of going through a phase of infrastructure software where venture capitalists are cashing out and they need to get these companies that have been built on cash burn into cash positive. And one of the ways to do that is to try and capture more value through switching the license. Obviously it's a short-term boost because you've built your community and you're then trying to rapidly monetize that community through a license change. Whether that's sustainable 5-6 years from now, I don't know. I imagine it's a quick shot in the arm.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know, Rachel, do you want to add anything to it?
And I think that was really lovely. I think for me, it's just really watching what's happening with not just any single open source move, but what's the trajectory of the ecosystem overall. I think is a really important one, of thinking about not only what's happening with any individual vendor, but kind of what's happening in concert. And I think I'm a little bit, I'm hopeful that open source will continue to have a viable path forward, but I do feel like we are at a bit of a crossroads right now in terms of people trying to, in concert with each other, change the definition of what open source is. And so I think one of the things that I think is going to start to matter again soon for people is thinking and caring about what is that true definition of open source, and thinking about kind of that OSI definition of open source. And I think that's, and I think Steve already gave wonderful examples earlier about different open source business models that have been proven to work in the past in different companies. So hopefully we as an industry can come together and find some successful business models.
I think we need to protect that open source definition and accept that it's open source. I think it's perfectly legitimate, and you know, I'm not trying to be negative on any of these companies that switch. That's a perfectly legitimate business decision, and they are businesses and they need to fund themselves. Otherwise, you know, they don't exist, and then there's no one building the software at the end of the day. And you know, maybe you need to look at where you're using your software from, and whether that is open source or not, and whether that company may have to switch at some point. There's a huge defense. People can fork the software. At the end of the day, that's how Payara was born. We forked Glassfish. So it's not impossible, and it's not impossible to build businesses that then build off forked projects.
Exactly.
That's the whole, and I've heard, you know, that might happen in this case, that some people may fork and continue it on. And actually, I think another sort of secret on open source is that it probably doesn't take that many people to maintain that software and drive it forward, especially in the open source project, because you know, a lot of software spend in software companies is on software maintenance and software support, which you don't necessarily have to do in the open source project. So you could probably drive a project forward with a few tens, maybe, of engineers. That costs some money, but it doesn't cost $400 million. So I think I'd say there's an absolute future for open source. And foundations, we haven't touched on that question. Foundations help, but I don't think they prevent any of this. I mean, they're just a way of maintaining that project in a sort of vendor neutral fashion. But many commercial open source companies are built off foundation software. And the thing that have to do is they have to build a trademark value around with a different name. So, you know, Confluent instead of Kafka, and the you know that the license of the core isn't going to switch, but what you don't know that anyone's going to continue to contribute to it. So it's open source foundations don't solve the problem, but they sort of help you be aware that, you know, it's not going to switch license.
Yeah, and thanks for mentioning that. That's true. It's something we did talk a little bit in our previous episode, but in this context, it also matters. So talking about industry being possibly at the crossroads, as Rachel, you mentioned, do you think the case of HashiCorp and a few others that you've also mentioned before who went similar route is where most of the open source software industry is heading?
It definitely is enough data points that we're starting to see a trend, but I do think that we are also starting to see more vocal pushback against that, and more people coming to the defense of the OSI definition of open source. So like I truly can see it go either way. I'm hopeful that we go to a place where open source is healthy and thriving and well maintained by a broad base of maintainers. That might be a bit of a utopian vision, but that's what I hope for.
Yeah, I'm super positive that open source will continue and the projects will continue. I think it's the natural endpoint for companies that that we've seen in the past maybe decade that have grown rapidly off the back of an open source project, that they will naturally switch at some point because their business model requires them to switch. You can't just keep once you're reaching the sort of size of HashiCorp, $500 million organization, you can't just keep burning cash. You're not going to find enough investors that are going to give you another $250 million every year unless your growth is crazy. So I think it's a natural conclusion for that sort of organization. But that's not a reflection of open source. I think that's just a reflection of venture capital funding behind some of these open source projects. I mean, so I think that, but I think the dangerous bit is what Rachel's alluded to, is these companies then trying to subvert the definition of open source at that point. There's many open source projects that will continue and that can be profitable or have vendors behind them or have no vendors behind them and be super successful. So I think you just got to separate business model for maybe primary drivers for certain projects compared with the project itself and the open underlying software.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. Makes sense. Do you guys have anything else to add at the end? Because that's, I think we've covered quite a lot on the HashiCorp case and hopefully given our listeners some good context to how to interpret the move and what it means and where it leads.
Well, this is great. And I was originally feeling sad about the timing that we didn't get to bring this up in the first episode, but given the range and depth of our conversation today, I'm glad it actually just got its own space. So
yeah, I'll pick one point actually. If you pick a company like Payara, because we forked the software, which is interesting because then we could never license switch because we forked the software and therefore weren't the original licensee. So only companies that have, hold the original licenses and totally under their control are companies that can even do this. So, we could always build commercial pieces around the software that were not open source or under a different license, but then, that's not the core. So if anyone's forked or a fork occurs, then those people can no longer ever do this. So, which is an interesting point of open source, a bit interesting defense sort of point for open source.
There's many angles to it and so many faces of open source. All right, thank you. Thanks very much, Rachel. Thanks, Steve. It was great to talk to you again, and I hope we'll get a chance to have another conversation at some point soon. Maybe not too soon, so there won't be any crazy announcements coming out anytime after this recording, but I definitely would love to have you on our podcast at some point soon again. Thank you.
thank you.
Thanks.